Well, we're starting a new series today. It's called This is for Everyone. Jesus is for everyone. God's grace is for everyone. God's mercy is for everyone. God's forgiveness is for everyone. You know, sometimes we could think, oh, I don't measure up, or you could maybe have someone in your mind who's like, well, not for them. No, God's grace, God's kindness, God's goodness, Jesus, He's for everyone. And so as we begin this series, we always have a memory verse that we go through over the course of a series, and this one comes from Romans. I got to get it right. It's not remembered yet. Romans chapter 10, verse 13. Romans chapter 10, verse 13 says this: for everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. That's a beautiful promise. And that is for you. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. But it's also because we often think of salvation in terms of like that one pivotal moment of our lives. But I also know there's moments in our lives where man, we just need God to step in. And you've probably been there. It's like God, I need you. And God will sometimes lead us to that. Sometimes it's His grace that kind of breaks us. And we say, okay, God, I need you in the midst of this. And the promise of Romans chapter 10, verse 13 says, for everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. In fact, it's on the screen. Will you guys all read that with me? It says, for everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Absolutely beautiful. So I don't know what circumstance you're in or what circumstance you will be in. And I do know this about the nature of God, that His promise for you is that when you call on His name, you will find salvation in Him. And it is a wonderful, beautiful, wonderful, beautiful promise. All right, I'm going to go right at it today, okay? Today we're talking about forgiveness is for everyone. Forgiveness is for everyone. And usually you could think in terms of forgiveness of for everyone, meaning it's something that I need to do. But ultimately what I think, what at the heart of what that statement is that forgiveness is actually for you. When you think about the nature of God, here's what I know about God, is that God is for you. He is not against you. And there are things that He calls us to that maybe we don't like necessarily. Maybe we're like, I'm not sure how this would be beneficial. And yet if I can trust at the get-go that God is going to be for me, that He's not against me, then I can understand that forgiveness, learning to forgive, is for me. And I would say that to you right now. God is for you. And when I said we're going to step right into it, I'm going to ask you just a question. And I'm going to get right in your life. Is there someone in your life that you need to forgive? Is there someone in your life that needs your forgiveness? And maybe I even said that wrong, that needs your forgiveness, but also that you need to forgive, that God actually wants to release you from unforgiveness. One of the hardest things to walk in, one of the things that we hold on to sometimes is resentment. And man, resentment can eat us up. And I know you know this. I know that you've experienced this moment where someone has wronged you, someone has done something, said something, and it was real, and it was heavy, and it had weight, and you're holding on to it. But I also know that sometimes, resentment is, someone told me this after first service, resentment is the poison we drink and think it's going to harm someone else. And we hold on to it, and it starts to eat us alive. And so forgiveness is for you. And so I would ask that question again, who in your life? I'm not asking for any audible response, but who in your life is God calling you to forgive? And God even show us right now, who in our lives, who are we holding captive? Who are we holding on to? And God is saying, no, I want you to forgive. Why? Because forgiveness is for everyone. Now, there's a few things up top, because sometimes forgiveness is tricky. And I recognize that forgiveness is tricky. I recognize there's some interesting dynamics. And so 3 things that forgiveness is not, okay? Because I think this is important, because that person might be in your mind and you're like, I'm trying my best to forgive and I don't know if I've forgiven. Well, forgiveness is not reconciliation. And sometimes we have a hard time with that. Reconciliation is between 2 people. Reconciliation says, I forgive you, you forgive me, and now we're going to be restored together. We're going to come back together. And what I know about forgiveness is that's not always the case. Is that sometimes forgiveness is one-sided. It's saying, okay, I will forgive you regardless of your response, regardless of whether or not we're reconciled or restored again. And that's sometimes hard. But I also know that that's the nature of God. I know that God extends His forgiveness to us, whether we reconcile with Him or not, whether we want to be restored with Him or not. His hand is out there. And so forgiveness is not reconciliation, because reconciliation is 2 people. Forgiveness is 1 person. It's making the decision. It's yes, I will extend forgiveness to you no matter what your response might be, which is hard sometimes, right? It's difficult. The other thing forgiveness is not forgetting. We often have that cliche, forgive and forget, forgive and forget. I don't know if you've had this experience, is sometimes there's been something that's happened or is done to me and I've sought to forgive with my whole heart, but man, it doesn't leave my mind necessarily. Any of you ever have that struggle? You're like, why am I still thinking about this? Why am I still holding on to this? Maybe I haven't forgiven. Well, I'm not sure if forgiving and forgetting is necessarily what we're called to. Like, sometimes I think we can step into forgiveness by remembering and saying, no, I have let them go from that. I have freed them from that. Sometimes, I would say forgiveness doesn't mean that there's not any consequences. Forgiveness doesn't mean that there's not consequences for what happens. It's like, yes, there's supposed to, yes, we can put up boundaries in our lives. If someone has wronged us, it doesn't mean that they keep on wronging us into our harm or something. I would say it this way, like you could forgive someone, but the state of New Hampshire may not. Like, you would still have to go through the consequences of that. You might still need to get the restraining order. And so there's all forgiveness. Forgiveness doesn't mean that there's not consequences and there's not wisdom that has to come in the midst of that. And so it's not reconciliation necessarily, and it's not means no consequences, and whatever the third one was, I don't remember. Was it not forgetting? That's hilarious, by the way. God's funny. Okay, so what is forgiveness? Well, forgiveness is personal. Forgiveness is personal. Almost any circumstance where you're struggling with forgiveness, you could say it's a business, you could say it's an institution, but really there's probably a face to that. There's probably a voice to that. There's probably a conversation that in the midst of that. Forgiveness is personal. Forgiveness has to do with people, because people are tough. People are difficult. But then I would finally say forgiveness is for everyone. Forgiveness is for everyone. Forgiveness is for you. And so God show us the people. God show us who it is, like maybe even in these moments that you're wanting us to forgive. Because this is real. Like, I don't want just to be a voice from a stage. It's like, no, who actually in your life is God saying, I want you to extend forgiveness. I want to free you from resentment. I want to free you from bitterness. I don't want you to live in that any longer. God, who is that you're calling us towards, Lord? And then help us through in the midst of it. So Matthew chapter 18, Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he's talking about like difficult circumstances, like how to deal with conflict. Like, you need help figuring out conflict. And what he says is, like, if you have wronged your brother, if someone has wronged you, he says you don't just talk about it with everybody else. He says you have a conversation about it. It's like you got to talk about it. Like, you gotta work through it. And so sometimes we want to bury things and we don't want to deal with things. But Jesus says if your brother has sinned against you, he's like, go to your brother, go to your sister, and talk with them about it. And sometimes that's the most terrifying thing that any of us would want to do. We'd rather talk to everybody else about it. I don't mean to step on toes. Maybe I do. We want to talk to everybody else about it, but we don't want to talk to them about it. And so Jesus said, no, here's the healthy way to do it. It's like, have a conversation. And maybe that's what God's calling you to, is like, have a conversation and bring it together. And so Peter in Matthew chapter 18, later on after Jesus is talking about that, will come to Jesus with a question. And it's a question that's a good question, because it's a question that I have, and it's questions that you have. Is like, well, how long do I keep forgiving these people? You've had that question. How long? Because usually, like, people are strange and people are difficult and people are hard, and it's usually something in their character, something in their nature. It's not like they say one thing one time. It's like they just keep saying the same thing all and over. Like, how many times, Peter will ask, how many times am I supposed to forgive? That's a good question. How many times? Now, usually I ask that question, or we ask that question to say, okay, when do I know the limit is there? How do I know this is the moment where they get canceled? This is the moment where they get deleted. This is the moment when they get unfriended. And not that any of those aren't necessary at moments, but how many times? Peter's his question. And that's where we pick up today. Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 through 22. Then Peter came to Jesus and they asked him, Lord, how many times? And maybe that's how you have asked this question. Lord, how many times? How many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? How many times? Now, the rabbis of Jesus' day had a phrase, they had a number to it, and their number was 3. Before baseball, they were talking 3 strikes. Then 3 times. And we have 3 times. Like, we culturally cliche kind of, we say 3 times. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Don't fool me a 3rd time. I was like, we're done. So we have our kind of 3 strikes. And so Peter, he's been walking with Jesus for a little bit. And he's heard Jesus say stuff like, I want you to be extreme. Like, I want you to go the extra mile. And so Peter, I think, Peter's like, okay, I've been walking with Jesus for a while. I think I kind of know what his answer is going to be. It's not going to be the 3 times that the rabbis are going to talk about. Let's double it and add 1. Jesus, let's put the cherry on top. Like, Jesus, how many times am I supposed to forgive my brother or sister who's wronged against me? 7 times? Help me to know if it's 7 times. And so this is what Jesus' response is. He says, Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Other translations will say 70 times 7. And that doesn't mean, because this is how our human minds work. You're like, all right, when you're at 76, any of you are like, they're at 76. Or they're at 489. That's not what Jesus is saying. It's like Jesus is saying, well, how much am I supposed to forgive someone? And maybe that's your question today. It's like, how much am I supposed to forgive someone? And Jesus will say, let it be endless. Keep on forgiving. And like, I don't want to keep on forgiving. You're like, well, do you want to keep living in the angst? Do you want to keep living in the frustration? Do you want to keep living in the prison of unforgiveness? Jesus says, no, here's what I want you to do. I want you to keep on forgiving. Why 7 times? Genesis chapter 4, things go awry rather quickly. Genesis chapter 3, you have Adam and Eve in the garden. They eat from the fruit. They're cast out of the garden. They have kids, Cain and Abel. Cain kills his brother Abel because he's jealous of him. It's like that has gone off the rails very quickly. You go from eating fruit to murder fast, within a page. No, it is. Like within a page. Like I know there was raising up the kids and stuff, but it happens fast. Well, God tells Cain that I'm going to set you out of I'm going to send you out from the land, and I'm going to put my mark upon you. And Cain is like, no, you can't do this, God, because anyone who sees me will see that I am cursed of God, and they'll kill me. And God makes this promise to him. He says, Cain, anyone who lays a finger on you, that's an ad lib, but anyone who does anything to Cain will face 7 times the vengeance of God. Okay, that's interesting. You got 7 times the vengeance of God. God's vengeance, not anybody else's vengeance, which is very important. Scripture will say, vengeance is mine, says the Lord. We don't have to worry about that. Praise God, because we overreact in our vengeance. So a couple great-grandchildren later from Cain, a couple great-grandchildren later from Adam and Eve, you'll come across this other guy named Lamech. Say Lamech. Lamech. And Lamech, I mean, he's a bad dude. He's a bad dude. And he's like, if Cain is going to be avenged 7 times, then Lamech, you do anything to Lamech, I'm coming after you 77 times over. So he's like, if God's vengeance is 7 times for Cain, Lamech, don't you dare touch me, because if you touch me, I'm coming after you 77 times over. That's Genesis chapter 4. You go from God's vengeance of 7 to Lamech is like, I'm going to take it in my own hands. You touch me 77 times over. And it doesn't take you long to realize how quickly things are going to fall off the rails when you think about humans. If you hurt me 77 times over, well, I'm getting used to back, and now that person's getting that person back 77 times over. Now we're getting each other 70. It doesn't take long before the flood happens, by the way. It all starts unraveling under human vengeance. And so Jesus says, we're not going to live like that. Jesus says, we're not going to be a people seeking revenge. He says, we're going to be a people of radical forgiveness. You want to revenge 77 times over. No, I want you to keep forgiving. I want you to keep forgiving over and over and over and over again. Forgiveness is for everyone. So what is forgiveness? Well, forgiveness is saying you don't owe me anything anymore. Now, that's hard. I realize that is as easy as that is to read on that screen right there or that screen over there. Like, forgiveness is saying you don't owe me anything anymore, because usually whenever you've been wronged and you want to like make things right, we sometimes have a stipulations of unless you do this, say this in this way, like forgiveness is not coming. No, what forgiveness says is like you don't have a debt anymore. Forgiveness, like that person in your mind right now, it's like forgiveness is telling them, you owe nothing to me anymore. Like, I'm not holding a tally. I'm not holding anything against you any longer. The book of wrongs, the records of wrongs that I've held against you for so long is like, I'm throwing it away. Forgiveness says, you don't owe me anything anymore. And you might raise the question, well, how could I possibly burn the book, right? How could I possibly let go of everything that you did, said, all of that? How can I possibly let go of maybe decades of what you have done? And I say, well, what good is it holding on to it? Is the first question, but how could you do that? So Jesus will tell a story because Jesus is really good at telling stories. And this is what he says. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king. The kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold. I'll read that again. A man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought before him. Now, since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. Now at this, the servant fell on his knees before him. And he begged him, be patient with me, which is hilarious. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. The servant's master took pity on him. Canceled the debt and let him go. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him with the same sentence, be patient with me and I will pay it back. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay back the debt. Now, when the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged, and they went and told their master everything that had happened. It's an interesting story. Jesus is funny. Jesus is a phenomenal storyteller. Because Jesus is going absurd here. Jesus is like going absurd in the number that he uses here. He says, there once was a king who was settling his debts, and a man was brought to him. And the man didn't come on his own free will. It says the man was brought to him, and the king is reading off his debt, and the debt is huge. And I don't think it's accidental. I think Jesus is being as far as absurd as he possibly can. He said he owed him 10,000 bags of gold. Now let's calculate this out. Let's figure this out. We got a little comparison of what this guy's debt was, because I think it's important to understand exactly what Jesus is saying. 10,000 bags of gold. 10,000 bags of gold. One bag is 1 talent. A talent is how much a person weighs, by the way, mostly like someone's weight. So when someone says you're worth your weight in gold, that's a talent. 10,000 of your weights in gold is a big debt. And so of this debt, it says that 1 talent weighed the weight of 1 person, which best equivalent we can come to is $13 billion. Now, I don't know about you, but that's some change, right? That's a little bit of thing to, like, how in the world do you pay this back? It would take, this is what's interesting, it would take 200,000 years for this man to pay it off. So what is Jesus doing here? He says, once upon a time, there was a man who had an insurmountable debt. In the most way you can understand it, here was a man who had a debt so heavy that he could never in 200,000 years pay that debt back. And the hilarious thing is the man's like, hey, master, just give me a little bit of time. Just give me about 200,000 years and I will get your debt paid back. And we laugh at that. We're like, that will never happen. And then what I think is actually more absurd than the debt, because if you really think about this, this is where the absurdity comes in. You could say $13 billion of debt in a story is absurd, but you know what I think is more absurd? Is that the king canceled it. What is forgiveness? Forgiveness says you owe me nothing anymore. Forgiveness is you don't owe me anything anymore. And can I tell you, that is the insane forgiveness of God. The insane forgiveness of God is like, man, I'm 46 years old. I've accrued a lot of debt. Like, there's been a lot of decisions contrary to what God would have me do that, man, if you looked at my life, and let's not just talk about me. Let's talk about you too. If we were to look at our lives of the decisions we made, the rebellion, the rejection, the things that we've chased, the things that God called us to do that we're like, I don't really want to do that. And the things that God said, I don't really want to do this. You're like, well, I kind of want to do that. Like if you were to accrue 46 years of life, I mean, there isn't a debt. And I could say, well, God, just give me a couple more years and I'll make it up to you. And God's like, no, it's not going to happen. But here's what I'll do. I'll take all your debt and I'll nail it to a cross. I'll put all of your debt on I don't know of any other way to do it. I don't know of any other way to do it. The only way is for God to intervene and says, that which you cannot pay, I will pay for you. That for me makes the most sense that I can make of it. It's not somehow I'm going to take 200,000 years and pay off this debt. No, it's God saying, I'm going to step into the gap. I'm going to stand in the way and take your debt upon me so that you can find freedom, so that you can be set free. That's absolutely beautiful. And can I tell you, that is the good news of Jesus. As Jesus is saying, I will set you free. And I will say to you today, as hard as it is to believe, because I can appreciate how hard it is to believe that type of debt being wiped. That's hard to understand. It's like, I don't understand the grace of God. I don't understand the grace of God. The grace of God is astounding. It's absolutely amazing. Some would say reckless. It's like, what is this grace of God that just says, you don't owe me anything anymore? Can you imagine leaving this place with a full understanding you don't owe him anything anymore? But that you've been set free. That you've been forgiven. And in Jesus you can be. And because of Jesus you can be. Everything that you're carrying around, all the baggage, all the burdens, all of that stuff, everything that you've done, everything done to you, just given to him. But then there's another story. Then Jesus talks about the other person, because here's what happens next. It says, but then the man who has just been forgiven the insanely absurd debt canceled because the king had pity on him, then goes to his fellow servant who owes, how much does he owe? Let's get it right. It'll be on the screen here in a second. He owes 100 silver coins, which is not a small amount, which I think Jesus is very smart, which is a very much understatement. I think Jesus is very smart at what he's doing. It's not a small debt. Because the wrongs done to you is not a small debt. The things that people have done or the things that people have said, Jesus isn't belittling it. He's saying it still had some weight to it, a cost to it. He says that at the same time, there's a man who was owed 100 silver coins. Now, 100 silver coins is 100 denarii, which is 100 days' wages, which is not small, which is a $15,000 debt. So I can say there's some significance there in the same way that I can say there's some significance in the things that have done to you by the person that you can't forgive. But I think what Jesus would say, it's not $13 billion. And the man goes after his fellow servant. And he takes him and he puts him in. The man comes to him with the exact same plea. You can go back and read it. You can get your Bibles and you can read through it again. It's the exact same. He says, Master, have mercy on me. I will pay back. And the man takes him and puts him in prison. Which, how are you going to pay him back? Sometimes we in prison. He puts him in prison. How are you going to pay off a debt while you're in prison? That's a question. What are the things that we're holding people to on our unforgiveness that they can't fix anymore? There's no way to take it back. I can keep them in prison and just hold them in contempt the rest of my life. Forgiveness says, you don't owe me anything anymore. You don't owe me anything anymore. And I can appreciate the weight of that. For the person that comes to your mind, I can appreciate the weight of that. But here's what I know about forgiveness is that forgiveness brings freedom. Forgiveness brings freedom. Forgiveness brings freedom. And selfishly, whenever I think of that phrase, forgiveness brings freedom, I think, my first thought is that it'll bring me freedom. I don't have to carry this anymore, will bring them freedom. It's like, oh, I'm so nice that I will forgive you. Right, that's what we think sometimes forgiveness is like, I'm going to let them go. I'm going to release you. Like in my great graciousness, I'm just going to let you go outside of my freedom. But you know what I think freedom really frees us from? It's from the prison that we put ourselves in. The freedom of resentment and bitterness and walking around our lives owned by some circumstance that Jesus says, man, that's not the life I have for you. And so maybe you're in unforgiveness right now, and here's what I know Jesus would say to you. That's not the life I have for you. And it hurts, and I get it, it hurts, but forgiveness brings freedom. This is what happens next. It says, then the master called the servant in. This is the rest of the story. The master called the servant in and said, you wicked servant, he said, I canceled all that debt. I said of your debt, you don't owe me anything anymore. Because you begged me. And this verse 33, I think, is the statement of it all. It says, shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he could pay back all that he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother and sister from your heart. I mean, forgiveness is like heavy in terms of the kingdom. It's like we are called to forgive. Jesus, as he's teaching his disciples how to pray, you'll notice it. Maybe you don't like that part of the prayer. He's like, forgive us our debts. Forgive us our trespasses, as we have already forgiven those who have trespassed against us, as we have already forgiven the debts of others. Jesus will say it this way in another place. He says, he's like, why do you keep looking at the speck in your brother or sister's eye? And you're like, because they're annoying, and the speck just keeps bothering me. Any of you fixated on somebody, you don't even know if you're fixated on. I realize in my own life, like you don't even realize, like they come to a point in your life where they can't say anything right? They can't say anything right. They can't do anything right. Like you see this happen in relationships. You see this happen maybe at people at work. It's like, man, all I see is their flaws. All I see is the mistakes that they've made. All I see is their past. And Jesus will say, you keep staring at the speck in their eye, and you forget that there's a telephone pole hanging out of your eye. And Jesus is like, you have been forgiven so much. You have been released. This beautiful promise of the good news of Jesus is you don't owe anything anymore, that you can walk out of this place in absolute freedom because of what Jesus has done. Now, why are you imprisoning other people? And why do you keep standing in a prison that you've locked yourself? Forgiveness means freedom, and it's realizing, man, I have been forgiven much. I've learned a lot from my Weimaraners. They're my dog. I've had a couple. If you've ever come across a Weimaraner when they're young, you would realize I need prayer. They're something of a dog. We've had 3 now. They've all been given to us at 1 year because people can't take them any longer. It's not a joke. They actually are given to us because people can't take them any longer. And I know why. Because even after a year, like, whoa. So our first one, his name was Joe. I love that dog. Yep, there's a dog. And the first year that we had him, he's now 2 years old, and man, he was at that time, and he would just destroy everything. All the time. All the time. Guaranteed. We leave, something's going to be destroyed. Cell phones, shoes, you name it, destroyed. And that can start to weigh on you a little bit, right? You start to it's only so long, right? Just like the person that you're thinking of. Like, it can weigh on you. And I remember one particular time, God is gracious, sometimes, like, gracious all the time, but sometimes I see it. And I came home one time, and our house was destroyed. Everything was destroyed, and I'm mad. I'm like ready. I'm like ready to go after him. Like, you've been there, right? Maybe it's not a dog. Maybe it's something. I am ready. Like, I am ready. And there he is shaking underneath the table. Because he knows too. Dang dog. And I'm not saying I hear God audibly. But I did hear this. Not audibly, but I did. This is what went in my mind. John, that's just you. That's just you. And I love you. You make messes all over the place. You chew up, eat up everything all over the place. But my grace is sufficient for you. And I will meet you in your weakness, and I will meet you in your brokenness. And you'll be my dog. And I'll be your God. Now do that for other people. Now do that for other people who make messes in your life, and do that for other people who have specks in their eyes. Do that for other people so that we might be a culture of forgiveness, not retribution. So that my people might be known by their willingness to forgive and show grace and kindness as you have experienced in me. Jesus is having a meal with his disciples. It's what we celebrate in communion every Sunday morning. And he'll take a piece of bread and he'll hold it up to his disciples. He'll say, this is my body given for you. And you know, I think about, there's this moment when Jesus is on the cross and he says this insanely gracious thing. Because people are spitting on him and people have mocked him and people have put a crown of thorns on him and he's hanging on a cross. And he says, God on the cross says this. He says, forgive them, Father. Forgive them, Father, for they don't understand what they do. And so we remember that. We remember that every Sunday morning together. It's like, forgive them, Father, for they don't understand. My grace will be sufficient for them. So we take.